please tell me about what your work is all about?
I work with colleagues at the Georgia Institute of Technology in the Augmented Environments Laboratory, and with colleagues here at BTH, at the Blekinge Techniska Högskola. And we're particularly interested in using new media technologies for designing experiences. We're experimenting with a relatively new technology that has come into the public eye increasingly in the past few years, namely augmented reality. Augmented reality is a technology now that runs on mobile phones and tablets and other devices that are widely available. It combines a view of the world around us with information taken from the internet or stored in the computer itself. So it's a combination of the virtual and the physical. This combination allows us to do interesting things in various realms. And as I said, what particularly interests us is to design experiences. These experiences relate to cultural heritage, to artistic practice and expression, and to entertainment.
How come that the art world is so interested in this area?
Well, I think digital art in general, or media art, has been a growing area of interest for the art world now for the past several decades. And as new forms of media come available, artists tend to be pioneers in experimenting with those new forms. So that was true of video art in the 1960s and 70s, and increasingly true of digital technologies in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s. I think the interest in augmented reality in the art world is growing precisely because it gives artists an opportunity to experiment with a technology that doesn't take us out of the world, but keeps us in the world, engaged in the world, but at the same time allows us to use digital information.
That sounds like a combination of sort of engagement in the society as well as the art in itself.
Yes, and indeed a lot of digital art using augmented reality or mixed reality does indeed have social themes and political issues that it engages with. There are also, however, artists who use the medium for more traditional explorations of form and for the kinds of things that artists have done for many, many decades with other media technologies. So there's a broad spectrum of possibilities that digital art can engage in with these new technologies.
But as a professor of Georgia Tech and cooperation with BTH, how can you, in your science, benefit from artists' work?
Well, Georgia Tech is a broad spectrum of different faculties and departments. We work closely with the computer scientists in the Augmented Environments Lab, and they are interested in developing the technology further. So one of the ways that you develop a technology is to give it to people to use, see how they use it, and then see what needs to be improved. And the kinds of issues that we confront when we try to design experiences for cultural heritage or for art become issues that computer scientists then can engage with as they try to improve augmented reality technology for everyday uses. My own work, my department is called Digital Media at Georgia Tech, and we're interested principally in the ways in which new media technologies are used in our culture. So for me, this is a very central kind of work in itself. It's not simply that we're trying to improve the technology, but that we're also trying to understand the meaning of the technology for our culture today.
May I go down on earth in Karlskrona? Last night you saw some performances here at the Blekinge Museum. In what way were they augmented reality?
Well, the term augmented reality has become more and more broadly applied. Originally, it meant very specifically a constellation of technologies that frankly were only available in the laboratory. I have fortunate enough to work with some pioneers of augmented reality at Georgia Tech, particularly my colleague Blair McIntyre. And the lab, for really for about 5 years or so, was focusing on the kind of traditional augmented reality technology that involved wearing a headset and having expensive tracking equipment. But now, with the advent of mobile phones that can do a form of augmented reality, the whole term augmented reality has broadened. Sometimes people also use the term mixed reality to refer to any combination of computer information that is projected or made available to the viewer on their phone or on other devices, in addition to a physical presence. The experiences, the pieces that we saw last night, I think would fall under the category of mixed reality. They used sound and computer projection. They had tracking equipment that would track the motions of one of the actors. They had a variety of digital devices, but they were also embodied physical performances. They were plays. They were what artists in Western art have called performance art, which again is several decades old. So what we saw last night was a variety of different forms of augmented mixed reality or simply digital art.
Some artists would argue that the new media brings people further apart, since you can you don't need the physical closeness when you communicate. Is this is this counter that attitude?
Well, I think we could talk about the issue of whether all digital technologies separate us or bring us together. Many people have argued just the opposite, that the internet, that social media gives people an opportunity to contact each other in ways that they didn't have before. But certainly the kinds of pieces that we saw last night in the performances, the work that we're talking about here with augmented reality, always involves physical presence as well as digital information. So it's always a combination of the virtual and the physical, and it doesn't have to separate people any more than any other medium does. I mean, after all, when you think about different media, they're used in different ways, and some media are individual. They're used by one person alone. That was true of the book, right? The printed book, which is hundreds of years old. I mean, you could say the book separates people because it brings us into our own world. So obviously, being alone doesn't necessarily mean that you're not having an important experience. Having said that, as we just mentioned, augmented reality is something that happens in the world, and I think emphasizes the relationship between the physical and the virtual. I think one of the exciting areas, beyond what we traditionally think of as art, one of the exciting areas for augmented reality is the broader field of cultural heritage. And by cultural heritage, we mean everything from a visit to a museum or a particular cultural location to an experience that you might have outside in the world, in the city of Karlskrona, for example. The augmented reality technologies that we can now put on a smartphone or on a tablet make it possible to have an experience with the history and the culture of a place while you are touring that location, to get information, historical information, or other kinds of experiential information delivered to you right at the device when you're standing in a particular location. So we've been experimenting with cultural heritage experiences that could happen in cemeteries, in historic homes or historic buildings, and indeed even in battlefields. In the United States, for example, in the eastern half of the United States, there are a series of battlefields for the American Civil War. And if you ever go to these places, what you basically see is an empty field. Mm-hmm. The history of that location is hard to call up. But with augmented reality, we can imagine holding up the phone or your tablet and actually seeing the battle taking place in front of you. So at in Georgia Tech, we've experimented with an augmented reality experience of a tour of the Oakland Cemetery, a historic cemetery in the city of Atlanta, with Auburn Avenue, a historic street that was the center of African American culture in the first half of the 20th century. Here in Karlskrona, I know that my colleagues are talking to people from the Marine Museum about ways in which we could use augmented reality to bring history of the fascinating marine history of the city to life for visitors. One of the real advantages of using smartphones in this context is that the visitor brings their own device to the experience. So you don't have to worry about handing out something that the museum keeps and then getting it back from the user, but also because it's their own device, it can be personalized in various ways. In the museum context, it seems to me there are two interesting ways to use augmented reality. One is to bring the external world into the museum. So in many cases you may see a piece in the museum, but you don't get a feel for what it looked like in its context in the world. Augmented reality can help show you images or perhaps a panorama of the place where that object was located. The other side of that is that you can take the museum out into the world. So you can imagine having installations, exhibits that are part of the Blekinge Museum but are actually located outside, but through geolocation, in the city of Karlskrona itself.
So it seems that the work for the museum people will be easier because they will have more devices to make history more vivid. It also must be a challenge, because when you see something with your own eyes, you really believe it, and of course then it has to be true, hasn't it?
So indeed, it is, I think, more of a challenge for museum designers and curators and experienced designers to figure out how to use augmented reality in the museum context effectively. We, after all, have decades of experience with physical exhibits, but we're only beginning to get a sense of what it would mean to stage an augmented reality experience inside a museum in a way that enhances the visitor's experience to the museum and doesn't detract from it. So it's an exciting new field of possibilities. And I think one of the keys is to think about the whole experience that the visitor has in the museum and imagine ways in which technology can enhance that. That enhancement could begin even before the visitor comes to the museum, perhaps by having a website that previews what the visitor is going to see. Perhaps also the website involves something that the visitor downloads to their phone so they can bring it to the museum. Then when they're at the museum, the experience may involve, as I've said, the combination of what they see in front of them and something that the phone provides. That can be audio as well as video or still images. And it can also be the case that the phone is tracking the choices and the experience that the visitor has in such a way that the visitor can go away and later, perhaps on a website, access that experience again. So you can think about the whole time that the visitor is engaged with the museum as an experience to design. But it's not an easy thing to do.
The Artline project, which I work for, is partly about art, of course, but also the notion of a public space and what you can do with that. Of course, there will not only be museum people and curators that will come into this world. There will also be anybody, even people that might not have all those good thoughts. Maybe they want to provoke, or I mean, you could easily put provocative items in a museum, geotagging them and being visible only in the telephone, for example, the smartphone. How do you see this sort of underground possibility of this technique?
Well, first of all, I would say that indeed we want to design experiences in such a way that the so-called average visitor can appreciate them and even participate in them. And augmented reality does, as you're suggesting, have the opportunity to be designed in such a way that the visitor can add their own thoughts, comments, perhaps even images, to the experience for other people to see as well. So there's opportunity for participation, and that participation can take many forms. When you talk about an underground or kind of disruptive experience or engagement with this technology, that's certainly something that art has been experiencing or experimenting with for some time. And so there are already some interesting examples of disruptive artworks that intervene in museums or galleries. There was a famous example in 2010 in which two artists staged a kind of underground exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Visitors could come in and with their phones, and they hold up the phones in the galleries, and they would see other art pieces floating around in the air, pieces that hadn't been designed or exhibited, staged by the curators at all, that were in fact kind of an alternate museum, an alternate gallery that was available. And so there are exciting possibilities for disruption. What's interesting and nice in a certain sense from the museum's perspective is that, of course, these disruptions are virtual. They don't actually intervene in the space in a way that is harmful. And, but I think in the long run, it's more interesting to speculate on ways in which the museum can incorporate the viewer's thoughts, feelings, ideas into the exhibits. But that is also a challenge.
Of course. Talking about public space, it has been the arena for art of different kinds since civilization began, I suppose. We have these statues in the middle of squares with kings sitting on horses or pointing somewhere. And it has a symbolic meaning, of course, and they are rooted in their own time and the concepts of that time. Will we have, do you think, artworks in augmented reality in our cities and cityscapes in the future?
We already do. And there are important contrasts, obviously, between those kinds of artworks and the ones that you're referring to. The most obvious is that they are virtual, and therefore they are ephemeral in a certain way. By ephemeral, I mean that they can disappear. They can be taken off the internet. It's much easier to remove a virtual artwork than it is to take a big statue out of a square. And of course, part of what the statuary meant in this historical context is a kind of permanent or quasi-permanent record. So when you do something virtually, when you do a virtual statue that you can only see when you hold up your phone, you're doing something that is already a little bit disruptive and somewhat different than a traditional piece of public art. I think one of the things that Artline is trying to do is explore that contrast and think about what does it mean to stage art digitally, to have that aspect, the ephemeral, the instantaneous, the interactive aspects of art be part of this public experience.
Do you think people will be less offended by an augmented reality artwork than by the same in physical sense?
I mean, I can only speculate that they would be less offended in the sense that they don't have to look at it, and it doesn't actually stand in the way, and it's not something
I mean, people get
see.
offended by television shows, and they can easily turn off the television set.
No, that's true. You never know what's going to offend people, but it is an argument that you can make that, well, you know, you don't have to turn your phone on, and it isn't something that's defacing or marking the public square in the way that a statue would. I think that if we're talking about offensive or pornographic or any of these kinds of terms, relative to different media, that we've developed different standards. And you know, a public statue may have one set of public standards about what constitutes appropriate art, appropriate display. television may have a different standard, films have a different standard, novels or written, literature another standard as well. And we obviously have and will have our standards for these new kinds of digital expressions.
And the search engines have their filters, of course.
Yes.
Maybe you could think of something like that in augmented reality.
Well, and in fact, insofar as the augmented reality pieces are often on the internet available through the filters, through the search engines, the filtering is already happening. There isn't enough internet art or augmented reality art yet that I'm not aware of any public outcry about any such pieces, but there may be some.
That's an interesting future. Talking about the future, what developments do you foresee in this field?
So I've learned that at least my own ability to prognosticate is modest. And so I wouldn't try to make any long-term projections about the future of this technology, or more importantly about its cultural impact. What does seem to be the case in the next few years at least is that augmented reality on the phones and on the devices that we already have will continue to grow in importance. And there is on the horizon the possibility of certain devices that you would actually wear, like glasses on your head, that could also deliver augmented reality experiences. The most obvious example of that is the Google Glass project, which is about to come out very soon. It will be interesting to see whether a significant number of people in the population adopt that technology, wear these glasses. If they do, that would be a significant change in the way that we experience augmented reality, because the images would be always there. Even with your phone, you have to decide to hold up your phone and turn it on and look through it. But with something like Google Glass, you've already made the decision. It's on, unless you want to turn it off. And so it's there ubiquitously, and that may in fact make possible a whole different set of augmented reality experiences for art, cultural heritage, as well as commercial uses.
What about the people that are not connected at all to the internet?
Well, yes, they exist.
They do.
Although in the developed countries, certainly in Europe, Northern Europe, there are very few of them. I mean, if you look at the number of people the number of smartphones that exist in these countries, it's an enormously high percentage of the population. And even groups that you had originally thought would not necessarily adopt, such as the elderly, are doing so. Now, they may not be using augmented reality, they may not be using the latest programs and latest services, but even that probably will continue to increase in popularity. So, as I said earlier, I would be loath to make any projections or predictions about the extent of the development of augmented reality, except to say that I think it's going to continue to grow in the population in the coming years.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So did we get good sound?